everyone. Welcome to this presentation. I was really excited to find out that I could record, so hopefully this makes it a little more interactive or interesting to watch. Sorry. The joys of at-home presentation making. Hi, Weenie. Okay, so you're gonna have to leave me alone. Let's get to it. So my presentation today is going to be about a bunch of things. I'm going to be talking to you about migraine in relation to my research, and I'm going to transition into a discussion about social work and the importance of self-care. Somehow it will all come together and it will all make a certain amount of sense, I hope. Okay, so first off, what is a migraine? A lot of people have some preconceived ideas and notions of what migraine is. Often we hear of people describing migraine as a really, really bad headache. But the reality is migraine is actually not really a headache. Headache is just one symptom of migraine. Migraine is actually a sensory processing disorder. It's neurological. It involves a lot of different symptoms. It goes through a very specific process. There are different types of migraine. There are typical classic migraines. There are migraines with aura. There are ocular migraines. There are vestibular migraines. And all of these different categories carry with them their own symptoms and challenges. Migraines are really, really common. They affect 1 in 4 Canadians. And the majority of the people who are affected are women. However, men do get migraines as well. It's just not as common. It's a really highly stigmatized disorder, and it's really often misdiagnosed and undertreated in healthcare settings overall. So I just wanted to give you a rundown of what a migraine actually is. And this is a really good example of the 4 phases that migraine can happen in, not always for everybody, but this would be a very classic migraine for a particular type of migrainer. So the prodrome phase is something that occurs in a lot of cases where someone will have any number of these symptoms, and this is not an exhaustive list. This is just a list, I think, of the most common symptoms, but that phase can happen a few days before a migraine, perhaps a few hours before a migraine, and it lets the person know that something's going on in their body, something is reacting to something and that their threshold is low, and then a migraine is probably going to be happening sometime in the future. The aura phase is something that affects numerous people as well. And aura is a subset of symptoms that happen 30 to 60 minutes usually before a migraine. Really commonly we hear about things like visual disturbances, like some people see zigzaggy lines or spots in their vision. Some people get tunnel vision. Some people might see cloudy vision or have things bounce up and down in their vision. Also, vertigo can be an aura sign. Slurred speech can be an aura sign. For some people, losing feeling and going numb in their face or down the one half of their body, losing control of their limbs on one half of their body can be an aura symptom. So aura symptoms can be anywhere from really annoying to super debilitating. And they can affect people in very different ways. And they often affect that sensory processing area of the brain. They look and feel very much like a stroke or stroke-like symptoms, but the difference is it's not a stroke. So the symptoms are completely reversible. And the next phase is when the migraine attack actually happens. And a migraine attack can be anywhere from a few hours to several days. And what happens during that time is some people will classically develop a certain type of headache, usually on one side, in the eye. We need to calm down. In the eye, throbbing pain. It's a very specific type of pain. But for other people, they don't get the headache at all. Some people feel a lot of pressure in their head. They might have nausea. They might be very sensitive to sounds and to light. And that might be the migraine attack for them. Some people suffer from vertigo past the aura stage. So the vertigo is their primary migraine attack symptom. And that can last for days as well. So it really depends on the person and what type of migraine that they're having. The post-drome phase is when the migraine starts to calm down and come to an end, but the person still feels a lot of residuals from the symptoms that they've experiencing. They're probably really exhausted. You feel drained. You might have extremely low energy. You might be depressed. You might be euphoric. You might have trouble understanding things or focusing or concentrating. And that can go on for a couple of days as well. So this just gives you kind of a rundown of what happens to a typical migraine case, but not everybody experiences all 4 of these phases, or sometimes they might and sometimes they might not. It really depends on the person and the type of migraine that they're having at that time. So migraine, like I said, is something that is frequently underdiagnosed and undertreated worldwide. So patients have a really, really hard time even getting a diagnosis in the first place, let alone finding effective treatment. Treatment is really, really difficult to manage because what works for some people doesn't work for other people. And the medications that are often used for migraine are not migraine-specific drugs. Now, recently there have been more migraine-specific drugs, but in the past, a lot of the drugs that they've used and still currently use are drugs that are often used for mental health conditions, that are used for epilepsy, or are generally pain medications. The really long history of migraine being associated with personhood and defects associated with the individual. So it was really seen as a psychosomatic disorder throughout history and not something that was biological. And so it wasn't legitimated. And it wasn't really until 2006 that it became legitimated in the Neurological Association and Circle in the United States and in the West. So patients have been really fighting for a long time to be recognized as, look at me, I'm going through a real thing, please take me seriously, because no one would take them seriously. As a result, though, physician training has been lacking, and it's still lacking. So on average, physicians train about 4 hours on all headache disorders combined. And migraine is kind of shoved in there, even though it's not really a headache. And so patients' embodied experiences are also often taken up by the medical discourse, often in very problematic ways. We are still represented in medical texts and institutional information as being problem patients, or again, back to that contested illness patient, that psychosomatic patient. And even though it's recognized as having a biological etiology now, there are still many physicians and practitioners who still feel that the disorder is tightly associated with stress and certain personality types, which is really problematic. At the same time, stress can be a trigger for migraine. So there's a bit of a conflict there. Public awareness and education around migraine has also been lacking. So if you think about the ways migraine has been represented in the media, it's often presented as a white woman who, has her head down and she just needs to pop a pill and she's going to feel okay and be able to live her life. And these are usually targeted towards middle-class people. And the reality is migraine is something that affects all different types of people. And it's often something, oh, Winnie, stop. Shh, shh, shh. Sorry. It's often something that gets overlooked by certain minority populations, especially. So if the general population is having a hard time getting a proper diagnosis, you can bet that someone in a minority population is really going to have a hard time getting a diagnosis because they're not really represented in the material. So the things that I'm really interested in looking at through my research are I want to narrowly understand how migraine patients' experiences are constructed in Ontario health settings. So I want to understand how those experiences actually come to be as they are. But more broadly, I'm really interested in understanding what is the social life of a diagnosis. I want to understand how does a diagnosis get constructed and what happens to that diagnosis as a person moves through the system, because it kind of takes on a life of its own. And it's something that's actually very interesting because it applies to a lot of different people in different situations. So one of the ways that I'm looking at my research right now, one of the ways I'm framing my research questions is through a method of inquiry called institutional ethnography, or IE. It was a method developed by a Canadian sociologist named Dorothy E. Smith. And as a sociology student, she was really taken by the fact that women's experiences were often not counted in sociology. It was often men's experiences that traditional sociology and theory was based on. She was also really taken by this idea that traditional research in sociology and a lot of other disciplines, they generally abstract data. So we usually have this theory up here, and we work from this top-down approach, and we selectively appropriate experiences that we want to fit into that theory. So she decided to do a different approach where she wanted to start with the actual experiences of people. And she wanted to understand how those experiences come to be as they are by really figuring out how things work in an institutional setting. So that was her goal. So she originally designed this to take into account women's standpoints, but over time she developed it as an alternative sociology for people in general. So it's an ethnography for people, it's not about people, and that's really how she frames it. So she took from a lot of different sociologists and a lot of theorists and philosophers in order to construct IE as a method of inquiry. Very prominent in her work is the works by Marx and Engels, and this notion of that we should be focusing on people's real sensuous human activity. So these institutional ethnographies really want to focus on the real doings and work of everyday people. So when she talks about work processes, she really wants to look at the very fine, small details of, in this situation, what does the patient have to do in order to get treatment? What does that actually look like? Who do they come into contact with? What are the work processes that occur for that to even take place? How do doctors do their job? How do they know how to do their job? What informs their practice? And it kind of works its way along in order to understand all of those work processes in detail in order to make sense of this institutional picture. So as you can see here, this is Dorothy Smith's small hero diagram, and this is a really good illustration of the things that she's trying to get at, or she was trying to get at through IE, and what someone who's doing IE would try to be getting at. So as I said, you kind of work your way through a system, you understand how a regime is put together. It's kind of like PI work, that's how I see it. It's kind of like I'm doing an investigation and I'm like a detective and I'm on the search to figure out how this institutional regime functions. Winnie, they're just children. I want to know how it works. And so as you can see from this diagram, all the different levels and things that you're tapping into as you're trying to understand that process. So last year when I did my master's, part of the work that I did to kind of get me started, I did a map. And this isn't an IE map, there are actual maps in IE, but I decided to do my own map because I wanted to take the information that I knew from my own experience as a migraine patient, and I wanted to map all of these different institutional medical patient processes that I went through in order to get a diagnosis. So I started to really write everything down and make sense of where I was in position to these different systems and what did I have to actually do, all the way to getting treatment. And what started to happen is as I did this, I started to see the system a lot bigger than it was in my head. And I started to realize that we really take for granted all of these different steps we kind of go through on a daily basis when we're engaging with these institutions. So then my next step was to do a more detailed map. So on this map, what I was really trying to get at was I was taking just a snapshot of a section of the previous map, which was that initial physician visit. And I started to take a look at what are some of the textual processes that occur during a visit with your doctor. So things like the patient file is activated, prescriptions are written, best practices for how to diagnose and treat the patient are something that inform the doctor's work. And there's a whole lot more, obviously, that aren't accounted for on this map because I didn't actually do those in-person interviews, so I didn't have access to that information at the time. But there are all of these different forms and all of these different pieces of text that really inform and replicate behavior in institutional environments. And those are the things that really start to coordinate our behavior when we're interacting with institutional regimes. So that was something I was really interested in getting at and trying to figure out. And because my master's was only a year, the one thing that I could focus on realistically, even though I wanted to do a lot more, was figuring out through my own experience a problematic. So in IE, the problematic is the starting point. That is the tension, that is the disjuncture that you want to start your research from. And the problematic often is framed as wanting to understand how something is put together and how something happens. So the problematic that I kind of came to after doing my IRP was that there's this huge tension between medical discourse and patients' lived bodily experiences. And I came to this conclusion after reading my patient file. So I got a hold of my patient file from my family doctor and my patient file from my neurologist. And I was having a really hard time figuring out a problematic. And I was going through my patient file and I was looking at all of these entries that my doctor had made over the years. And I kept seeing over and over again, NAD, NAD, NAD. And I was like, what is that? What does that mean? So I Googled NAD and I saw no abnormality detected. And I was like, oh, this is interesting to me. And the way the case notes were written, they were written using a structure called SOAP. So in SOAP notes, the physician will write down the subjective experience, which is what the patient is experiencing. They'll follow that up with the objective experience. So that is what the doctor can actually observe and measure. The A is for assessment. So that's what the doctor believes is happening. And then P is for the plan. So they write in what they want to do next and what the next steps are. And I was really taken by this whole notion of my experience as being subjective and their experience as being objective. So I was reading through these case notes and I kept seeing me coming into the appointment complaining about this whole list of symptoms and being in distress, and my doctor just writing NAD. And I was like, huh, that's tense. There's a tension there because obviously, even though he couldn't detect an abnormality using a blood pressure cuff or blood work or whatever other tools that he wanted to use, obviously I was telling him I am experiencing vertigo, I am experiencing visual disturbances, I'm throwing up every day. And these things were not counted as objective knowledge. And so that troubled me quite a bit. And I started to get really interested in how this notion of subjective experience could be turned into something objective and then go through this process and get fed back to the patient. And then the patient would kind of take on this new objective knowledge and let that define their condition or personhood. So for my PhD work, that's something that I'm going to be following up with as I talk to other migraine patients and try to figure out if they've had similar experiences, or if they've experienced other things that could be other potential problematics or threads for me to follow. But I found that very, very interesting. Okay, so welcome to the story time slide. This is going to be a much longer slide. But what I wanted to kind of do was I wanted to figure out how to marry the topic of my research with the topic of self-care and working in the field and dealing with vicarious trauma, which is something that Kelly wanted me to cover. And I figured what better way to do that than to tell you a story of my own experience in true IE fashion. Yeah, so I wanted to focus on my true lived embodied experience. I'm going to be talking about things that I've dealt with in the field. I'm not going to be going graphically into anything too much in detail, but if you at any point feel triggered or if you feel that something is triggering something in you, by all means, go to the next slide. And certainly reach out and contact me or the teaching team if you need any type of support. So how did I get to where I am now? After I graduated from school, I worked in a few different spaces before finding myself working in addiction care at a women's treatment center in Toronto. So I was still relatively new to the field at the time. I was in my mid-20s. I was getting married. I had just moved to a new city and found myself away from family and social supports for the first time in my life. I had also started to experience some really strange symptoms: dizziness, visual disturbances, nausea. I passed often these things as stress-related. I didn't give much thought to them because they'd only last for a few minutes and they happened really infrequently. So I just kind of put them off until they stopped happening infrequently. And I don't really know how to better describe to you what happened to me than to read to you an excerpt from my master's IRP. I remember the first time it really hit me. I was working at my desk. I gazed at the computer monitor. I began to feel a little uneasy and I didn't quite know why. Have you ever had that feeling that something just isn't right before a stomach bug hits you? That was the feeling, a complete and sudden state of anxiety coming out of nowhere for what appeared to be no reason. I decided to continue with my work when suddenly the words on my screen began to blur and float, rising towards my face in slow motion. Shortly thereafter, I began to feel as though I was sinking into my chair. I had difficulty focusing on anything in the room, and I felt like throwing up that amazing pad thai I had eaten earlier that day. I decided to get up and make my way down the hall, which very quickly became a funhouse equipped with a moving floor and walls like quicksand that my hands sunk into as I placed my palms against them in order to steady myself. Was I having a stroke? I asked myself as I barricaded myself in the washroom, too embarrassed to say anything to my coworkers. I had been at this job for less than a year. I had never once called in sick, and very rarely did I ever call in sick as a practice. I don't remember ever going home early from any job, and the thought of breaking that record annoyed and disappointed me. Looking into the mirror, I was pale. I sat on the toilet seat, hunched over, and closed my eyes, hoping it would pass quickly so I could get back to work. Although many of my symptoms began to calm down, the swirling sensation persisted. I managed to climb down the long staircase to the main floor of the building I worked in so I could speak with my boss, who was at the central office with other staff. It was late in the day on a Friday. I was done at 4 p.m., so it didn't seem too bad to tell her I needed to go home. This was just a fluke. I had a virus or something. I approached my supervisor and let her know what was going on and problem solved how to get home that afternoon. I personally thought I could wobble down to the subway station and take the subway home, but I was charged not to. As it turned out, a coworker was leaving for home that day and decided to drive me to my apartment. It was a good half-hour drive away in traffic. The movement of the car on the packed freeway, the Gardner, and through the busy city streets might as well have been me traveling by a rickety wooden roller coaster that was built in 1932. You know what I'm talking about? Those roller coasters, you know that they should have been ripped down long ago, the ones that look like they're falling apart, but for whatever reason, you go on them anyway, and then at the top of the hill, you pray to some random deity not to let you die that day. That's what it felt like. Start, stop, start, stop. Every movement triggered the contents of my stomach to rise up to my throat, into my mouth, and every pause resulted in a feeling, a sense of movement, even when I was still. I rolled down the window to feel the cool September air on my face, hoping that it would calm my nausea enough for me to get home without barfing in my colleague's car. As we approached my building, I stumbled out of the car like a drunk who had too much to drink at happy hour and made my way inside. Why did I have to live on the 20th floor? I thought to myself as I waited for the elevator in the lobby, my slouched body propped up against the wall. I made my way into the elevator that for the first time seemed like a device designed for torture as it began its ascent to my floor. As the steel box rose to meet my destination, I felt my body pull to the floor and drop down with force. By this point, the vertigo was so intense I could barely hold myself upright. Ding! I saw my floor number light up on the control pad through a hazy filter that seemed to cloud my vision, making my surroundings appear indistinct and vague. I crawled out of the elevator after what seemed to have lasted hours rather than the mere 30 seconds it probably took in reality. I consoled myself with the thought that I didn't need to see to get to my apartment door. It's just to the left, it's just down the hall, I can make it. I asserted to myself, slightly panicked, I'd end up at someone else's door looking like a fool attempting to get in, or that someone would see me on the floor and intervene in some way. How embarrassing would that be? I reached for the door handle, inserted my key, and felt a sense of relief as the door unlocked and I pressed myself in, swaying on my feet, a final moment before I collapsed on my couch. This is where I stayed, perfectly still, for the next several hours, until my husband came home from work and my brain continued to sense the room spinning around me, making me feel increasingly more agitated and helpless, a feeling that persisted almost daily for what seemed like forever. Unknown to me at the time, I was suffering a migraine. So the field itself, and this is how I want to tie it together, it holds a lot of compassion for our clients, but not always for those on the front lines like us and like you will be, who are essentially putting themselves in precarious and difficult situations on a regular basis. So as my condition progressed in those early years, in hindsight, I can clearly see I was taking care of everyone else except for myself. That's what I had been trained to do. I could hear my dad all the time in my head saying, "Toughen up, Sue, you need to toughen up." So that's what I did. I pushed everything aside and I toughened up and I just focused on getting through every single day. My husband at the time was completing his master's degree and I was working to support us and I refused to fail at that. I didn't want to disappoint him. I didn't want to disappoint anyone else. So I pushed on. I went misdiagnosed for nearly 2 years, during which time I learned to cope with my symptoms in many different ways. I learned to make my body rigid in order to keep myself from falling, even though this resulted in pain and musculoskeletal issues. It almost seemed like everything I ate or drank triggered an attack, so I stopped eating and drinking, especially during work hours. Outside of work, I became more isolated and I stopped socializing. And this was really easy to do because I had just moved to Toronto. I didn't have any friends. No one was checking on me. So I could just hide and I could sleep. And I really liked to sleep because you can't feel sick when you're sleeping. I think one of my greatest achievements during that time was learning how to wear the best poker face ever. So I could do a one-on-one session, I could teach a class, I could run a therapeutic group, and I could start getting these migraine symptoms. And I actually trained myself to appear super calm and collected. You wouldn't know it was happening. But obviously when I was able to leave the situation, I would completely be a hot mess and fall apart. Then over the years, things started to happen. My body kept breaking down, not just due to migraine, but due to exhaustion. I was always tired. I was angry. I developed anxiety. I started to have panic attacks. I remember the first time I had a panic attack after a session with a client, and I managed to hold it together for the session, but as soon as she left, my breathing was labored and my heart rate was high, and I just was shaking and I couldn't function, and I barricaded myself in the office until it passed, and I had no idea what in that session triggered it, but something obviously brought it on. I had tried to be honest with my employer from the onset about what was going on with my health. I was very honest from the get-go. And over the years, that honesty and my declining health ended with 3 separate discrimination grievances brought forward by me and my union. So what was happening was I was a really good employee and I did my job really well, so they couldn't fire me, but they started to do things that they fall into something called constructive dismissal. And that's where an employer makes an environment really, really hostile to get someone to quit. And the reason why was because I used my sick days. That was simply the reason. I used all my sick days on a regular basis, and they didn't like that. So I'd seen this happen a lot with people who were struggling with disability, and especially mental health on the job. And instead of offering support, agencies would react in ways that were really unsupportive and not helpful. So after nearly a decade of this life, my husband and I decided to make some changes. I was burnt out. We're going to talk a little bit about what that is. I was simultaneously trying to process my own trauma associated with having a difficult to control disorder and all the experiences that came with it, and the vicarious trauma I would be exposed to at work. So I was able to hold my shit together at work and present as a competent professional. At home, I was a hot mess. I tried to hide my struggles from my partner. I would actually schedule crying fits. I would wait till he went out to walk the dog or do an errand, and I would cry and try to get it out, and then I would pull it back in when he came home so that I wouldn't worry him or let him know what was really going on. But the reality is, I was really miserable. I picked fights. I was difficult to be around outside of work. I just wanted to be alone. I just wanted to sleep. And so we decided something had to change. So that's when I quit, and he was offered an opportunity to do his PhD. And I decided that I wanted to take some time to get my health back in order. And I wanted to go back to school and maybe look at doing something different. So my experiences as a migraine patient made me more cognizant and interested in stigma and the role that it plays in medical settings. And my experiences as a woman attempting to gain access to a diagnosis and treatment through an Ontario medical system, and as someone whose concerns were routinely ignored or passed off as all in my head, for lack of a better phrase, made me very aware of how gender was perhaps operating in certain spaces and not always in my best interests. So this is what led to my research, which has evolved since then to look at more than just gender. So I wonder, while I am here attempting to condense a 15-year journey into this 10-minute or so narrative, if you're confused and if you're wondering, why is she telling me all of this? What's going on? And the reason is this. So this notion of self-care in social work is really imperative to our work. It's something that we really need to take seriously. It's something that we need to take seriously for ourselves, and it's something we need to take seriously for other people as well. It's a really overlooked core competency, unfortunately. And I think a lot of people in helping professions often neglect themselves. And this can result in a lot of different troubles. So that's why it's really, really important that we start a dialogue. And as a program that we talk about self-care and we talk about the things that we're doing to try to take care of ourselves and put ourselves first, which sounds sometimes like a selfish thing, but it's not really. And I think it's absolutely necessary. So at some point in your careers, you're going to be dealing with some really shitty, raw, uncomfortable feelings. You're going to feel triggered. You're going to feel uncomfortable. You're going to feel um, all sorts of stuff. So this is about starting this dialogue and this conversation about how can I deal with that better? How can I cope with that when it happens? And for those of you moving into placement, I hope that the few things that I've listed in this presentation help you get started in thinking and reflecting on how to do those things. So the main things that I really want to focus on are things like compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma, and burnout. And I have here some definitions of what the difference is between them. So compassion fatigue is when you experience a certain amount of emotional distress resulting from being in a helping capacity. It's something I think that pretty much happens to everybody to some degree. It affects people in different ways. But there are ways that you can manage it and be on top of it so that it doesn't actually result in burnout, which results from prolonged exposure to vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue. And that's when you completely have a mental collapse from too much stress, physical and mental, either or both. Vicarious trauma is a little different, and it's also something that all of you will probably experience at some point. It results from having an empathetic connection to an individual who has experienced trauma. So basically, you'll be listening to a client and they will disclose a traumatic event to you, and through your empathetic connection and response, people start to internalize their traumatic experience and experience symptoms of trauma themselves. It's extremely common. It's not something anyone should feel bad about if they start to experience it. For myself, it's actually resulted in anxiety at times. When I wasn't feeling physically well, especially, I found myself being more vulnerable to it. But it is something that's going to start happening, and it is something that you can manage, though, and you can be on top of. So what can you expect going into placement? Let's even just start there. Let's not even worry about work yet, although I know some of you are already working in the field. This field is really challenging and rewarding at the same time. And I think a lot of people do this work because they're really interested in social justice initiatives. We want to help people. We want to help our community. We have a passion about something. We may have experienced something in our own lives that has brought us to this profession. And I think those are all amazing things. At the same time, our empathy can be something that's an amazing asset, but it can also be a big challenge because it puts us in a position to feel and take on some of these emotional challenges. So the one thing I really want to emphasize here, I think, is to expect the unexpected, which is something I was really told in school, but it didn't really hit home until I started going out into practice. So I was really unprepared for the field in many ways when I got into it. So I got into social work and I thought, oh, I'm just going to do a little counseling and I'm going to help some people and this is great. But I wasn't really thinking about it in terms of some of the more difficult aspects of our job, in terms of the vulnerable populations that we work with. I was extremely sheltered. I didn't realize so at the time, but after a couple of years in the field, I realized how sheltered I actually was. I realized how much my social positioning was shielding me from a lot of realities and truths of the world. And so it kind of just like whacked me in the face very abruptly, and that had an effect on me. So I can't answer what you're going to experience in the field. I can't answer what you're going to experience in your placement. I don't have a crystal ball. I can tell you to be prepared for some very stressful situations. And I actually wrote down a couple of things that really stood out to me, a couple of little stories. from when I first started practicing, because I know a lot of social workers. I don't know a single one who doesn't have war stories. I don't know a single one who hasn't been through a really traumatic situation at work themselves. At 40, I actually know a lot of social workers who are choosing to leave the field and go into a completely different field altogether, or who are going back to school because they can't do it anymore. Our jobs are really, really, really stressful, and they're really difficult. And with the way things have been shifting over the past couple of decades, with all the cutbacks that we've experienced, that's not going to get any better. It's only been getting harder. And I fear that it's going to continue to get harder. And I don't know, maybe as a collective, this is something that we can work through together. Maybe it's something we can start advocating for, better working conditions and whatnot. And I do think there are people that do. But overall, the condition in social services and nonprofit agencies can be very, very difficult. So I want to start off with placements. So I had a placement at Big Brothers Big Sisters in my second year. And back then, students were allowed to do home visits on their own without anyone with them. I don't think that that's allowed anymore. And I saw some really, really sketchy shit. So I would go to these home visits and I would see very impoverished families. I would see things that I would probably classify as neglect. I might classify as not quite abuse, but maybe on the borderline. And so I remember seeing all of these things at the one particular visit, and I remember going back to the agency and talking to the director about it, who was my supervisor, and I was extremely emotional, and I was very distraught by what I saw. And I remember her just looking me deadpan in the face and saying, "You need to toughen up. Otherwise, you need to find a different profession." And I was just like, what? Like, how could she say this to me? I'm empathetic. I feel something right now for these people. I'm trying to express it. But as I gained more experience over the years, I think that she had a point. And I think that she was absolutely right for saying what she said. And that's when things started to change a little bit for me and how I was looking at the situations that I was dealing with at work. The second situation that happened was that following summer. And I had worked at St. Joe's in schizophrenia services. And so we had a patient who came into the assessment ward, and she was in psychosis, and she had a cat. And the cat was alone, and someone needed to go feed the cat. So the social worker that I worked under said, "I have some cat food. I want you to go down and feed this woman's cat and take care of it." And so again, as a summer student, I was allowed to just, go to the stranger's apartment, talk to the landlord / slumlord, get him to let me in to feed this cat by myself. And I walked into this apartment, and it was like hoarders. It was worse than hoarders. It was like the worst situation that you have ever seen on hoarders. There were magazines and newspapers that were literally stacked to the ceiling all around the apartment. There was a tiny little maze path that you could kind of weave through the apartment through, but there was stuff everywhere. There was food rotting everywhere. There were critters that came with the rotting food everywhere. And I couldn't find the cat. I heard the cat, so I knew the cat was there. So I was able to put food down and get the cat some water. I really didn't like the idea of leaving the cat there. And if I could find it, I would have taken it out, but I couldn't. So that was all I could do. So I came back from that situation, again, very distraught, and was talking with a few of the psychiatrists on that ward and a couple of social workers about what I had seen and what I had experienced and what I was feeling. And again, the message that I got back was an extremely serious, you need to toughen up. Like, you just need to expect the unexpected. You need to get comfortable with feeling uncomfortable. And what you're feeling is nowhere near as crappy and horrible as what your clients are feeling. Like you're there to support them. So you need to push your feelings and what you're dealing with aside so that you can be there to support them. And that really stuck with me again over the years. And I don't want that to come out as harsh, but I do think that there's a certain amount of truth in it. And when we're not able to do that, I think we need to acknowledge that and we need to get real about that, right? So again, some of you might feel like that too. And if so, that's okay. It's okay that the field isn't what you expected. It's okay if you run into challenging situations, because you're going to. You will find a way to work through them. I think you're all super strong people who are resourceful, and you're all here for a reason. And from what I've seen, you're all very talented individuals. So I want you to draw on those strengths when these challenges happen so that you can kind of get through these situations that are going to come up for you that are going to be really sticky. My first 2 years post school, I had worked at 2 different residential facilities. So the first place was a shelter, and then the other place was a treatment center. I had been punched, I've been thrown over a desk, I've been threatened with a chair over my head. And every time I was told by HR that although technically I could press charges, that as an employee, I needed to expect violence in those settings. I needed to expect violence at work. You need to expect potentially violence at work. And I don't feel comfortable saying that, but unfortunately, I think it is going to be a reality for quite a few of you, if not already. Saying that out loud, it's really horrible. I started in this field nearly 20 years ago, and like I said, the cutbacks that we've seen are unreal, and you will most likely be working with less support than I had in the beginning, and I find that actually really concerning. And again, this is something that I think collectively we should start advocating for more protection for ourselves. I had a client once escalate emotionally to the point where she took a tack off of a wall and she started to carve up her arm with it, and she started to smear the blood on the surrounding walls while berating me and yelling at me. I was pretty much alone. There was one other staff in this very large building. There were clients coming in and out of the building, actually in the foyer where this was occurring. So I had to support them. And the client ended up at CAMH that evening, and after dealing with all of that, all I could think about was, I'm really glad she didn't attack me. And then I started to feel really, really bad about thinking that. You're going to have some guilt sometimes over having feelings like that. You're going to feel conflicted. And it's not that I wished her any harm. It's that I really was happy I didn't come to any harm. So you might end up having comparable experiences. Maybe you've already had comparable experiences, maybe not. You will have experiences though, and you are going to have experiences that you will find difficult to manage at times, which is why the next piece that we're going to talk about is really, really important. So stress, we all know stress can be good at times, but stress often is negative. It's something that can overload our bodies, and if we have too much stress, it can affect our immune system, it can affect us physically, it can affect us emotionally in many different ways. I think for those of you who are acting in caregiving capacities in the home, in your personal life already, perhaps you're taking care of elderly parents or a spouse or your community in general, or children, I think that can sometimes set us up for being more stressed out in human service professions because we're kind of on double duty all the time. So that's something to be very much aware of if that's your reality. And I think also being able to reflect on our life experiences and how they're impacting us is essential for coping with stress. So we really need to be able to sit back and say, okay, like what's going on with me today? Look at our reactions to things and look at how we can do things better for our own sake and for also those around us. All right, so what are the aims of self-care? You want to take care of your emotional and physical well-being. I think physical well-being often gets neglected, but as I kind of wanted to emphasize in my story, I actually didn't have a lot of issues emotionally until my body started breaking down. And when my body started breaking down, that set off a chain reaction. And then my mind started to go after that. My emotions started to ramp up after that. So I don't want you to discredit or devalue the emphasis put on maintaining good physical health, whatever that means to you, however you might want to achieve that. There's many different ways to achieve that. But it is really, really important. You want to manage and reduce your stress load. Honor your own emotional and spiritual needs, create and sustain supportive relationships, achieve a work-life balance that's effective for you. Again, there's no perfect way to do that, and I think depending on each of your needs, you're going to find a different pattern that fits for you. So what are the things that you can do to keep yourself safe? So I don't have an exhaustive list. There are many things that I could have put on here, but I put down some things that I thought were really, really practical. Identifying and managing challenges as they arise. I don't want you to let things pile up. When things pile up, things can go really, really wrong. Practicing really good time management so that those things don't pile up is really, really an effective tool. But also, again, like being able to reflect on what's going on with me today, how am I feeling today, so that you can pick out those pieces that might be problematic and then address them sooner rather than later. Which leads me to being aware of your own personal vulnerabilities, know your red flags, develop the ability to self-assess and practice reflection skills, perhaps journal. If you don't journal, please start journaling. It's a really, really good strategy because when you get those thoughts out on paper, you can see them in a completely different light sometimes. We all have red flags, we all have vulnerabilities. That is a really tricky area. So something that I was told in school was know your red flags, because if you are impacted by a certain area of work or by certain client circumstances, then you should excuse yourself from working with certain clients. So for example, if you have a particular bias. And in practice, unfortunately, that doesn't really work. So if you're doing private practice, that would be absolutely acceptable. If you're working for a nonprofit agency that's strapped and clients are assigned to you, you don't really have a lot of agency in choosing what clients to see and what clients not to see. And so this is a reality that all of you are probably going to have to face at some point. I've had to face it myself. And so the trick has been, how do I work with this client despite my potential biases, and being really aware of those biases and vulnerabilities and being able to set them aside for the benefit of the client. Really, really, really tricky, not an ideal situation. And this is something throughout your academic career, I would highly recommend you learn to process through. You talk about it with your mentors, with professors, with your peers, with your supervisors and the agencies that you're placed at, because it is something that can be very distressing for some people. Again, take care of your physical self. Make sure that you are eating properly, whatever that means to you, that you are engaging in some type of physical activity that you find enjoyable. Seek out adequate supervision. That is also something that I think is really undervalued. So supervision from your supervisor, supervision from your peers is really important. If you're working in an agency that values your emotional health and also your professional growth, Hopefully, I would hope they build in supervision on a regular basis. So on average, from what I've seen, you might meet with your supervisor for a full supervision once a month. And what we did at our last agency is we would also have a peer supervision where we would do that once a month and work through various issues that were happening with clients that we were dealing with. And that was something that was really helpful to me. There are some times when you might have stuff going on in the workplace that you don't want to share with your supervisor or you don't want to share with your peers because it might not be appropriate. If you're in a work situation through your benefits, you might have access to EAP, which can be really useful for supervision. During your placements, you're going to have seminar. You're also going to have each other. But I would definitely look at different ways of setting up ways of talking through your experiences and journaling through your experiences so that you can get the supervision needs met that you need. Develop a good support system. So again, that's kind of part of that, but this is more about your personal support system. So make sure that you have friends. Make sure that you're staying in contact with family, the people that make you feel good and positive about life. Make sure that you are able to socialize. If you're an introverted person like me, make sure that you're taking time for yourself. Make sure that you're being able to recharge your battery. So for me, that means I like to socialize, but I also really enjoy being alone. I like reading a book or binge watching a show on Netflix or playing my guitar. So those things are really, really important to me. And so depending on what your needs are, make sure that you're maintaining those things for balance. Another thing that I think is really, really helpful, and I used to do with clients, and I also started to do this with myself, was to keep track of the things that you're doing on a daily basis for self-care. So I would actually kind of do a checklist where I would ask myself, what am I doing for myself spiritually, emotionally, socially, and physically? And I would make sure that every single day I was able to check something off under that list, just to make sure that I was making it a priority and to make sure that I was, in some senses, putting myself first in ways that would make me feel good both physically and emotionally, and also it helped me to be better in my work. Seeking external help, so we talked a little bit about that in terms of supervision or supports, but I mean, don't be afraid to go outside. Like if you are really struggling and you need counseling yourself, if you need to reach out to an agency for your own support needs, again, this is something that can be really tricky depending on the situation, but do it. There are ways to do it that are safe. And for a long time, I really struggled with this idea that I am a professional in this field, and if I reach out to other people or agencies in this field, I'm going to look a certain way if I go apply for a job at those places later on. And I was really embarrassed about having to ask for help. And I felt a lot of shame about it. But at the same time, I really, really needed some help. I was struggling with anxiety. I really needed someone to talk to and to work through my issues with. So, I mean, I reached out for counseling through my family practice team. It was really, really helpful to me. And at the same time, I felt safe in that my information was kept private. And it's not something that would impact my career later on down the road in any way. But these are things that might come up for you and thoughts that might come up for you. And never have any shame in reaching out for help if you absolutely need it. Learning to say no. So this is something else that I would talk to clients about constantly. I used to do this exercise with certain clients who would struggle with saying no. And so I would have them go through an entire day in the treatment facility and tell them to say no to everybody and everything. And it was an interesting exercise. It often made them uncomfortable. but it was a really good way to get them practicing just saying the words in a safe environment with people who would be completely understanding about what they were doing. I've always found it hard to say no. I'm a people pleaser. I want to do everything for everybody all the time. I want to be on. I want to be seen a particular way. And I had to get out of that because it was hurting me. It was making me sick. And so over the years, I've learned there are definitely times when I can say no, or I can say no in a certain way, or I can try to negotiate, or I can make compromises, but I don't always have to do what everybody else wants me to do. And that's okay. And it's okay for you to do that as well. And so my last point is really, I want you to be kind to yourself. I want you to figure out what feels good for you. I want you to figure out how to balance things appropriately for you and not be hard on yourself, because I think that's also something some of us do. We're really hard on ourselves all the time. And that just results in putting extra stress on ourselves, and we really don't need that. So to conclude, and I hope you enjoyed this, but okay, we've all seen these memes going around. There's a few different ones. I particularly like this one. And there's a certain amount of truth in it. I know we laugh and we make jokes, but there's definitely truth in this. I've actually felt this myself. But it doesn't have to be that way. And I just really want to emphasize that, again, we're having this dialogue, we're talking about coming together and learning how to cope and deal with uncomfortable things we're going to see and feel and hear in the field, and that it's okay to be feeling those things. And it's okay if you struggle a little bit at times and try to process and work through what you're experiencing. That's just part of being human, and it's part of connecting with others. And I just want to emphasize that it's okay and that we're all in this together. And I really hope that this presentation was helpful to you. And again, if you have any questions or if you just want to talk about anything, whether it be my research or the self-care piece or any of the experiences that you're having in your field placements or in your work, absolutely email me, contact me. I'm always really interested to hear from you. And I'm also on campus when we get to come back to campus, hopefully, eventually. But yeah, thank you so much for your time, and I'll see you later.